In this video, we're talking Jean Grey decks.
Unleash your power! Jean, let's go!
What is going to be the best option for you starting day one? Will this redefine the meta? Is it a serious addition to a bounce counter, or is it a straight up bounce counter? And some trick plays. Before we get into the decks, day one for Jean Grey shouldn't be tonight. It's a Series 5 card. You want to use your Spotlight caches to try to get these if you want it. Better use of your tokens is any sort of Series 4 or maybe even Series 3 mystery if you want, even though I highly do not recommend that. The highly coveted Series 5 card that you want, use your Spotlight caches, save those tokens. So let day one be tomorrow. With Jean Grey, first you got to understand what she does. It's an ongoing card. Players must play their first card here each turn if possible. Key things to remember here is both players. It's not just your opponent. So if you're using this card, remember, you've got to play at that same location. It's a 3 cost. That'll play into some of these synergies. And with ongoing, you've always got to remember that that means it can get Enchantress. So that could certainly derail your plans. So make sure to have multiple win conditions. General good synergies with Jean Grey.
We make a good team.
First, Nebula. Play Nebula somewhere else, so that way once you lay down Jean Grey, you are getting points on Nebula. Obviously, anytime you've got Nebula, you got to worry about a Killmonger, but it's a great general 2-card strategy that can get you some solid points. A similar strat, but a later play for cards to play elsewhere would be Jean Grey, Storm, Professor X, and Spider-Man. Now, the key here is, though, you've got to be able to fill up your Jean Grey lane quickly to be able to pull this off. Because if you are not filling up your lane, then these cards are straight up dead. We'll see if we're able to get enough cards in the Jean Grey lane to be able to use these properly. Key things to think about is a 1 or 2 cost card with Jean Grey, which we'll get to in a minute, or a card like Brood, which instantly fills up that Jean Grey lane. Another thought that's sort of floating around out there, which I'm still sort of personally thinking about myself, is Negasonic on the Jean Grey lane. This straight up just helps you blow up something with your opponent playing there. I'm not sure this is necessarily helpful because sometimes an opponent might just play a 0 cost card there because it's just their first card that they need to play there. And if they've got something like Wasp in their hand that they're just playing there, then that Negasonic feels sort of wasted. Some really good combos with Jean Grey would be something like Ant-Man, Punisher, Mojo, and Dazzler. Mojo specifically because you know more than likely you and your opponent are going to have that lane full and Mojo's going to get that big bump in power. Punisher because, again, your opponent is going to be playing cards in that lane for sure. And Ant-Man because you're going to fill your lane more than likely. Now, again, the issue here is Mojo, Punisher, Ant-Man, and Jean Grey are all ongoing, which means that if somebody plays an Enchantress there late, you lose a lot of power. And Dazzler doesn't necessarily have to be played on the Jean lane, but if you're thinking that you're going to be filling up a lot of lanes, Dazzler is a great option. Now, one of the last cards, and hear me out on this, Orca. I think Orca might be pretty good because if you're not playing in a lot of lanes, or if you want to focus the Jean lane and maybe one other lane, that late play of Orca in the lane that you didn't necessarily focus to get 15 power is pretty strong. All right, now let's check out some specific decks. The first one I want to look at is a Grey Evo Control, basically your high evolutionary control type deck, but Jean Grey in it. You've got a number of low cost cards, and you've got some control cards as well. This might be trying to do too much control and too many lanes, but I think if you get a good feel for how this should play, it could be a really, really good counter to some other heavy meta decks like Bounce. Some alternate cards in here could be America Chavez to thin it out, Yellow Jacket to help pre-fill that Jean lane. Now, as far as the bounce counter goes, well, let's get to that after we talk about some of these cards. So the idea here, as always, is you got Nebula to play in an opposite lane of Jean. You've got Mojo to play on your Jean lane. You've got Wasp to help fill in that Jean lane if you want to. You've got Storm and Cyclops to help either put in their own specific lane, or maybe you put Cyclops in with Jean. That's not a bad combination considering that you know your opponent's going to play cards there. Juggernaut could be played in the Jean Grey lane to force them to keep playing in that lane. Though I don't necessarily love that play. I really like the Storm Juggernaut combo if you can get to it. High Evolutionary is not a card you want to play. That's really there to get the Cyclops to be able to ping your opponent, and even the Wasp to an extent. Now, the only reason Spider-Man and Professor X are in this list is because you've got to be confident that you can fill your Jean Grey lane. Without that, if it's not possible with this deck, this just kind of goes out the window and you sort of need to start from scratch again. Obviously, you've got the Daredevil to throw in there so that you can help determine where you might want to throw that Spider-Man or Professor X on turn 5. And if for some reason you've got a lot of 3s on that Jean lane or maybe that Storm lane and you need some extra power there, we've thrown in Silver Surfer for a potential turn 6 play. Specifically to the bounce counter here, if bounce for some reason is unable to play in the other lanes because you're Jean, you can absolutely start locking those down. Now, if they just kitty into your Jean lane and fill up their other lanes just like normal, then maybe you might want to consider locking down your Jean lane. But either way, the idea with bounce is always to be able to take lanes away. Make it so they can play in as few lanes as possible. That is the thing that hurts bounce the most. Will this one actually be too much control and not enough power in any lanes to actually win? That would be my initial concern, but I think with the proper execution here, you can lock down lanes, and really, you just need one more point than your opponent to win those lanes. So with proper control, this could really take off. Next up, we've just got a general Surfer control deck, very similar to what we were talking about before. In this particular one, this one was a pre-made. I don't know if I necessarily love the Invisible Woman here. You could certainly use it to maybe hide your Killmonger. Goose to limit anybody with power in playing in a particular lane. You've got Jean and Storm, just like I mentioned in the other deck. Brood to fill it up. Cosmo, Maximus, all of these cards are great synergy with Silver Surfer. And then of course Juggernaut to pop in on that Storm lane. Now the part that I'm not sure about this one is the Spider-Man, but again, similar to what we said in the other deck, if you can fill up your Jean lane and properly control one lane, this Spider-Man will insta-win you a lane because your opponent might be focusing on the Jean lane, which they are forced to do, and one specific other lane. So pick the lane that you think you can win with Spider-Man with a 1-card play. Generally speaking, I think Surfer is a card that you want to explore the most with Jean Grey, given with Brood and your ability to quickly go into another lane after playing Jean. I think that is going to be one of the top-notch synergies with this card. Staying on Surfer, this is just a Sera Surfer deck, not necessarily a control one, but you're playing similar to other Surfer decks where you've got Jean Grey here. You're going to fill up that lane potentially with Brood, and you're putting all your other stuff in these other lanes. And Jean might end up being a card you could play late. I mean, obviously you want to play it before turn 6, but if you're playing Jean with Surfer, it's not the end of the world on turn 6 because you still get some additional points on the Jean with Surfer. But it's just your general Surfer list with Sera trying to decrease the cost that you're looking to play. Of all the decks that we've talked about so far, this one is probably the one I find the least exciting. Not necessarily the least good, but the least exciting. This next deck I'm going to call Grey Guardian Surfing. It's a combination of a lot of stuff that we've talked about so far, in addition with adding some Guardians of the Galaxy. Because with Jean Grey, you know your opponent is going to play in that lane, which means Guardians of the Galaxy will thrive in these situations.
Oh! You said it yourself, bitch. We're the Guardians of the Galaxy.
In this deck, we've got Rocket because he's one of the cheaper Guardians of the Galaxy to play. And with Jean Grey coming down on turn 3, that means you've only got turn 4, 5, and 6 to potentially get any Rocket Guardian type plays on that lane. So you want to be able to potentially play 2 cards there. On turn 3, you do Jean, and then on turn 4, you do Groot and Rocket. 5, then you could still do Star-Lord if you hadn't already played Ant-Man or Mojo in that lane. But I would highly recommend Mojo in the Jean Grey lane because, again, your opponent is likely going to be playing a full 4 cards in that spot. You've got a backup of Punisher to play in that lane, again, as well as Ant-Man. You can certainly play Polaris in a different location to pull a card from the Jean Grey lane. So as soon as your opponent thinks, oh, great, I finally filled up that Jean Grey lane, you drop down Polaris and say, ha, just kidding, you still need to play in the Jean Grey lane. You've got Brood to help fill up a lane, considering you've got Dazzler. And again, you've got Surfer to potentially drop late to fill in some points on those 3-cost cards, which you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them in your deck. Now, the question I've got with this one is it going to be enough power all over the place? Maybe. You definitely need to hope to get that Nebula played down in a lane early that you're not going to play your Jean in. So think real hard about where you play that Nebula first turn and where you're going to play Jean. For me personally, this is one of the decks that I'm actually most excited to play a little bit. I want to see how it feels. Again, it probably isn't going to have huge power, but with limiting your opponent a bit, I like the concept of it a lot. And I don't know, part of me really just wants the Guardians to be able to have some place a little bit more in Marvel Snap. I do like so many 1-cost cards in this because it can help fill in that Gene lane quickly post the turn 3 plays. Other cards to think about are America Chavez to help fill in the deck, Goose to limit some of the power in a certain location your opponent might play. You could certainly add more control with Storm, Juggernaut. I mean, there's even a thought I'm starting to think about with Wave on turn 5 with some of this stuff. And depending how you're doing, you could always consider Doom to help fill in multiple locations, especially if you lean into that Wave play. We also have a Cerebro 3 deck that we could potentially put Jean Grey in. Now, right now, this one is not showing Jean. I think of all the cards in here, I might consider taking out Ghost Spider. The Bast is in here to help get 3 costs to your Cerebro, your Mystique, your Iron Man, even your Wasp or Luke Cage. So for that reason, I really like Bast still in this deck. So if I'm going to take out a card, I think Ghost Spider is likely the one I'm looking to remove, because what is Ghost Spider really doing? But people have all sorts of versions of Cerebro 3 or Cerebro decks in general, but Jean could absolutely play into that deck. And a nice thing to do with that is potentially have a low cost card early, playing Valkyrie on turn 5 in that same spot, and then playing Cerebro and Mystique somewhere else. Now that makes it so that maybe your Magic or Iron Man don't get to get played there, but if you're going to play your Magic or Iron Man in that same lane, just make sure you leave 2 spots so that way later you could potentially put in your Valkyrie. The next deck I've got on here is pure Jean Guardians, or at least that's what I'm trying to call it. I'm leaving 2 spots open here that I'll talk about some potential options in this. This one leans more into the Guardians play with Jean. I've also got the Nebula for an early play in an off Jean Grey lane. I've got the Ant-Man and the Mojo to help with fill up that Jean lane and take advantage of getting some points. But if you use those, remember, you might not be able to take advantage of your Guardians as much. Punisher as well can be a good card to play in that Jean Grey lane, like we've talked previously. But even if your opponent starts filling up that Jean Grey lane, you've got Nebula out there, so you can use your Guardians to play in the Jean lane and or that Nebula lane. So you can really start grabbing some power. Other card options I started looking into with this was America Chavez, as always, to help thin out that deck. Adam Warlock to an extent to potentially drop down. You might want to throw in like a Wasp card to be able to do that, because maybe if you've got Nebula, you throw in Wasp to throw down on your Jean Grey lane, and you've got Adam Warlock on Nebula. Or you know what, maybe you play Adam Warlock on turn 2 in your Nebula lane. That way you start playing Jean Grey on the other lane, and Adam Warlock can start bringing in more of your cards. Absorbing Man to potentially copy one of the Guardians. And you know what, I hate to say it. Well, you know what, I don't hate to say it, because I still feel like I'm part of that Kang gang, even though I'm admitting he needs a big buff. But he might fit into this, because there's not necessarily 2 cards that I'm like, yeah, these have to be in here. Maybe Kang isn't a bad option here. Truth is, if you start saying that, does that mean the deck needs to be relooked at anyway? I also don't mind throwing something like Leech in here, or again, a Wave turn 5. What about Leader? Or like I mentioned earlier, Orca. Especially if you lean into that Wave turn 5 Leader, I mean, it's almost like a GG, right? An Orca, if you play him on the left alone lane, you get 15 points there. That can get pretty strong. Play your Guardians right here. I think some of this Leader sort of Orca type play can really make this deck pretty formidable. All right, I want to highlight a tweet we had on Twitter when we were talking about this deck a little bit. If you want to chat about this or any other topics, there's the Twitter link in the description below, as well as the Discord. This particular deck was brought up by Brian Engelstein. It's got some mixes with some of the stuff we've talked about already. It's got some control, it's got wave, it's got high Evo lockdown, it's got an arrow for some tech and manipulation, and it's got Galactus. Brian calls it, hey, look over there. I could definitely see this being a fun deck to play. The risk is wherever you do play that Galactus, if you do late, you've got to make sure that you've got the win with that 7 power. But I do like the idea of it. I think part of it is because I really like the idea of playing Galactus in Deception decks where it feels a little bit of a good play versus where it was just your normal ramping, Doc Ock, Galactus, Spider-Man. That just is like, okay, cool. This one I like. Shout out to Brian. Thanks for bringing up this deck. Some other options that you can do with Galactus is you can sort of ditch this specific one, but if you want to do like Wasp or Yellow Jacket on the Jean, because you know you're going to throw that lane and you can then play Hobgoblins on other lanes, that way you can then Galactus those lanes. That's another option with Galactus as well. One last thing I want to mention with some of these decks, and again, shout out to Quinee. Equinox on Twitter. If you're not following her, go check her out. Like top-notch quality thoughts, decks, math, all that sort of thing. From all of these decks that we looked at, one other option that you could certainly throw in any of them, and I'm not going to focus on any particular one, but you could think about is you could play Jean on the right-hand side and fill in that right-hand side and, you know, either the left or the middle lane as you're playing on that right. And then on turn 6, you could Heimdall on the Jean lane. So you've got to leave a spot there and you're basically throwing that lane and you're hoping to have enough power in the other two. I think it's a really interesting concept and I wanted to bring it up because it's something I think people should definitely be thinking about. So we have some general control decks. We got Surfer, we got some Galactus, we got some trick plays. Again, wait to get Jean Grey until she's in the spotlight caches. Do not use your tokens on her. Any Series 5 cards that come out, I would highly recommend, if you really want them, save your tokens, just use the spotlight caches and plan and be smart ahead of time. That way you can use your tokens on those Series 4 cheaper ones that you might want to get. Do you think Jean's going to rock the meta? Do you think any of these decks are going to be working? What would you change about any of these, or what decks would you like to bring up that you think are going to be good? I'd love to hear your comments below. If you want to join the Discord and discuss them there, we'd love that as well. If you found this video helpful at all, or you want to help support the channel, please consider hammering down that like button. And until next time, I hope you have a wonderful day.